Well, you may have heard about the American highway system known as Route 66. Apparently, it was the original highway that linked Chicago and Los Angeles to drive along, and it became basically known as the original Main Street of America, and part, of course, of so much of popular folklore. Well, today I want to add another 6 to that, call it Route 666, and basically ask this question. Is there a highway to harm? A route for leaders that is so well traveled and so predictable that we can virtually plan out our destination by the road markers along the way. So today we want to talk about that Route 666, the highway to harm. Before we go there, let me just say we still have room for a couple more pastors in our pastors group. It's a group of pastors that meets around our mutual struggles with the obsessive nature of porn. And if you'd like to hear more about the group or simply arrange a one-on-one Zoom call with me as a pastor to talk about it, then email me as soon as possible at bandofbrothers.care@gmail.com. You know those posters that say, we're looking for a few good men? Well, that's what we're looking for. And even if you don't feel so good right now, as a good man, we're still looking for you. So please get a hold of me. I just really believe there's some guys out there that are needing a helping hand at this point. Okay, so let's get back to this idea of Route 666, the highway to harm. You know, sometimes the deep, dark, unredeemed part of me is drawn to a website. You say, okay, well, now where is this going, Vern? I'm drawn to a website. It's called despair.com. And it includes all sorts of demotivational posters. You know, all those. It's the exact opposite of all of those helpful motivational posters that you see often up on office walls, you know, like teamwork and motivation. Well, this is a demotivational poster. And this one is captioned by the title, Mistakes. And it shows the picture of a half-submerged, capsized ocean liner. And the caption under the ship is this: it could be that the sole purpose of your life is to serve as a warning to others. I mean, dark, totally. I get it. You know, and when I was thinking about this and that poster, I reminded me of an article I read, and then I found the podcast, which was around why pastors and leaders blow up their lives and ministries, why they capsize their boats, so to speak. Well, because none of us want to be solely to serve as a warning to others. I want to talk a little bit more about that podcast. It's actually from a Donald Miller podcast, episode 34. I think the podcast is called Business Made Simple if you want to check it out. And on that podcast, he interviews a guy called Stephen Mansfield, who has written a book on leadership crashes. The book that Mansfield has written is called 10 Warning Signs of a Leadership Crash. And essentially, he walks through those 10 signs, or what I'm just going to call route markers along the Highway 666. I actually just finished the Kindle book version of it this week, and it's fascinating reading. A leadership crash. You know, we've all seen automobile crashes on the road. I've been a part of a couple of them myself, but you know, we drive past a bad automobile crash, and we kind of rubberneck our neck and look around and try to see how bad it was. You know, we momentarily say to ourselves, I got to drive more carefully. At least for the next few miles, we're more cautious. And if you ask most leaders, you know, do you think a crash is inevitable in your life? They would, of course, say, no, well, no, of course not. Which, of course, is what most people who crash say. And we all know many stories of crashes that we hear about on our news feed or our denominational or pastoral gossip circles. We don't gossip, of course, but we're just updating ourselves for prayer, of course, for these unfortunate people who are experiencing such distress. But today, I want to ask you not to compare yourself to those people, but I want to ask you to measure your life based on the markers or processes that led these people into such troubled waters. And in his book, Stephen Mansfield, he essentially outlines the common factors, or in my analogy, the root markers, that he sees over and over and over again as he seeks to help pastors who've crashed their lives. He actually talks about more than just pastors. He talks about business leaders and other types of leaders as well. My area of concern, of course, is pastoral engagement with sexual struggles, with things like porn. And I found in Mansfield's points a number of them that I thought were especially significant. So over this podcast, maybe I'll do a couple more. I want to delve into some of these 10 that I think are especially pertinent to the struggle of that we have with pornography. And so let me, first of all, I'm going to pick one out of the 10. His reason number 2 for pastoral failures or leadership failures is this: the choosing of isolation. Now, it's always interesting when pastors get a hold of me. Some people find me on Google. It's always or word of mouth or different things. And I often say to them, and sometimes it's a little intimidating, hey, let's get together for a Zoom call. And because I like to see people face to face. And, I don't charge them anything. It's just like, hey, I just love to hear your story and love to chat with you. And one of the favorite questions that I ask guys, and by the way, you can chat with me as well, if you email me, and I'd love to arrange a chat with you. And here's one of the questions I like to ask pastors in particular. Tell me, is there ever a time where you felt close and connected with a group of guys? Some of the pastors I talk to have never had that in their lives. Others might point back to maybe a time at Bible school or college where they were in some sort of a band of brothers or accountability network, and they would say, you know what, I really felt connected at that time, which will usually lead me to a follow-up question, something like, and what difference did that make in your life? And they usually respond in a positive way to say, oh, it made all the difference in the world. Of course, you're always thinking to yourself, well, if it was such a good thing back then and made all the good differences in the world back then, so why is that not in place in your life now? Well, there's a lot of reasons, and we're going to get into some of those, but most, leaders that I talk to would say that that is not their present reality. They would say, well, if they've ever had it, they would say it's more of a memory or something I used to have. So, getting to that obvious question, why do pastors isolate themselves? What's the deal? And Mansfield comes up with 3 ideas that he thinks are at play here. And they're interesting. I think the first one is a little, I'm still kind of getting my head around it, but it's an interesting topic. Here's the first one. He says that some pastors isolate themselves because their view around authority, which is interesting. So what does he mean by that? Well, he says, some pastors have got to a place where they finally have the authority to call the shots, to make the decisions without any limitations. And they're not really interested in the limitations or restrictions that come with being in close, connected, accountable relationships. Now, here's something I've noticed. Now, I'm saying this as a Canadian pastor, so I'm not meaning to offend all my American pastoral friends, but I've just found this really interesting, that I work with a lot of pastors out of the American context, and there seems to be, in the States, a super high value for having your church classified as non-denominational. Now, there's probably all sorts of historical reasons for that, why, if you're part of that church, why your church is there. And I'm not really trying to rag on that a whole lot, other than to say this. This is where I think that spirit becomes problematic. If there is a sort of an unbridled type A individualism, individually as a church that says, we're here to stand on our own. Any other sort of person or outside body that would seek to restrain our authority, we're going to push away because we're trying to build something for God here. then I think it becomes problematic. I watched a show recently about the rise and fall of Jim and Tammy Faye Baker. I also watched another show called, something about Anna, where this socialite. It was interesting. I watched them both with my wife, so we skipped through some parts. But it was interesting. Both of them said this: "We're trying to build something here." I really noticed that. Jim Baker, I'm trying to build something here. I'm trying to build something for God. Don't get in the way of what I'm trying to build for God. Mansfield has this very interesting saying: isolation insulates us from information, inviting infamy. It's a great saying. So that's the first one, and that you might want to wrestle with that, but I do find that interesting in terms of one of the reasons why barriers get set up around isolation and why we choose isolation. Now, this second one is one that I identify with a whole lot more. Mansfield says we end up in isolation because of hurt. Doesn't it seem that ministry is just a driver's license to get hurt? And when we get hurt, we curl up in a ball around our hurts to protect ourselves. It's just natural. Animals do it. Humans do it. We can become almost a bit like a burn victim where just don't touch the place that hurts. Any sort of conflict or situation seems like another possibility of getting hurt. Think about it. If you don't really care about somebody that deeply, then it limits your ability to be hurt by them, doesn't it? I don't really care what you think, or I don't really care about you, so say what you want. You're not really that close to me. But if I care about you, if you're my friend, if you're somebody I've trusted, if you're somebody we've been working with in a close friendship context, and you turn against me, or you betray me, or you hurt, it's a whole different level of hurt, isn't it? It's felt far more acutely when it comes from friends or people that we care about, our friends. We're going to talk more about friendship next podcast, but let me just leave it at that for now. I think that's why David in Psalm 55, he speaks about this sense of betrayal. If my enemy were insulting me, I could endure it. If a foe were rising up against me, I could hide. But it is you, a man like myself, my companion, my close friend with whom I once enjoyed sweet fellowship at the house of God, as we walked about among the worshipers. You get this incredible sense of camaraderie, of friendship, of engagement, of vulnerability. And then it turns sour, and the sense of betrayal. It's no wonder David says in the same psalm the following: if I had the wings like a dove, then I would fly away and rest. I would fly far away to the quiet of the wilderness. How quickly I would escape far, far from this wild storm of hatred. I just want to run. I just want to get away from the hurt. I want to hide. I want to protect myself. Now, if you have the, so I think all of us, probably if you've been in ministry, been in ministry for 30 years, but everyone has got war stories. Some of them are almost surface level war stories. Let me put it this way. If you are, what I mean by that, if let's say, for example, you're the one that speaks or teaches regularly on a Sunday morning, like I do, and you're thinking and preparing and you're wrestling with a text, and while you're doing that, you're thinking about, well, okay, I think the text would lead me to say this, but if I say that, how much is that going to open me up to hurt or to pushback or negative feedback? I think it's a genuine application of the scriptural text in our present context, but it's going to open me up for hurt or pushback or feedback. I got an example of this from a recent Sunday. And whatever you think of politics I don't really care less, but that's not the point here. But recently I spoke on a Sunday morning, and I was trying to speak a little bit into the anger and rage that I was experiencing and seeing in many Christians around our Canadian politics. Yes, up here in nice Canada, it's alive and well. And I asked this question: how is it that we can hold up a sign in one sense with one hand that says Christ is King, and with the other hand hold up a sign that says F Trudeau? How do we bless and curse at the same time, really? Not everybody appreciated my attempt to apply biblical peacemaking into our fractious Canadian political reality. Next day, I received an angry call from somebody I had journeyed with for years, them and their family, had ministered to, had been there for. And it was a very, very angry call, and it ended with, "I'm never going to talk to you again." Now, that was hard. Where it's even harder, though, is when it has to do with the loss of a key friendship. Let me just say that has been the singularly most difficult thing to deal with in my pastoral ministry. When I have lost key, trusted, close friends, and they've said, "I no longer want to be a part of what you're doing. I've lost confidence in your leadership. You're off base, offside. We're leaving." And it's left me with the constant temptation to wall myself off, protect myself from new hurts, and essentially say, I am going to isolate myself. I am going to take a drive down Route 666. I know where that goes. That's what Mansfield says. He says, more than half the cases I've worked with have involved leaders who were hurt, who isolated themselves to nurse their wounds, and who thus let themselves open to the forces that created their crash. He goes on to make this distinction. He says, solitude is healthy in small doses, particularly if it's about recharging and having space to breathe. So he says solitude in that way is a good thing. He says, but isolation is unhealthy in any dose. Isolation is about pushing away the healthy. You know, of course, for those of us who struggled over the years with porn and things like that, you can see how things like porn are such an easy substitute, a solution to medicate, to salve those hurts, those wounds. It simply gives us an escape from these hurtful scenarios and offers us affirmation, escape, release. I mean, after all, people don't know what I have to deal with. The result, of course, of those actions lead to the last of the three reasons that Mansfield says are behind many leaders' isolation that heads towards problems. And reason number 3, now Mansfield calls it guilt, but I'm going to call it shame. And it's that diffuse sense of there is something wrong with me and I don't like who I see in the mirror. See, here's the simple truth. When I feel bad about myself, the last thing I want to do is be around people. Now, if I, for example, am participating in hidden, shameful, shame-inducing behavior such as sexual, looking at porn, sexual indiscretions, whatever that is, I feel like, you know what, that guilt, that shame is written all over me. Everyone can see it. I don't want to be found out, and the way that I protect myself and hide is by keeping people at arm's length. It keeps me feeling safe. So, things like porn make us feel bad about ourselves, that make us want to isolate farther, and leads us further and further into secret shame. I mean, it's a cycle, right? We do things that make us feel bad about ourselves, which leads us into shame, which pushes people away, and that drives us back to shameful behaviors, and it just goes around and around and around. It's why Patrick Carnes actually says the engine of addictive cycles are shame. Okay, so can we at all apply any redemptive hope to this message? Can we begin to turn the ship around before it hits the reef, so to speak? Well, the first part of like any metanoia experience is really, you got to start by recognizing what's going on in your life. I recently had a friend of mine, Mike, in one of my groups, and he described isolation using that age-old pastoral sermon, the metaphor that we use way too many times, the frog in the kettle. If you start really slow, the frog in the cold water, and you slowly, gradually heat the water up, eventually you can cook the frog to death simply by turning up a little bit at a time. You know how it goes. But this is what he said. He says, isolation is just like that. It's insidious. You don't really realize you're becoming more isolated. It's such a gradual thing. By the time, it's set in so far that you're so isolated, it's too late. You don't now have the ability or the courage to get out of the kettle. I've met leaders like that. I've met leaders who I look at them and they're so caught in shame. They are unwilling. It's like I know sometimes things that are going on because of what people say, but they will not say it out loud. They can't. They're too fearful. The water has got turned too high and too hot. Now, what's the goal of what we'd like to see in our lives? Mansfield uses a term or description, which is something I've certainly overused as part of what I do. Is he says every one of us men, the goal of our lives needs to be a band of brothers. It's a band of brothers that we fight alongside of. We hold, we walk together with. And he says any wise leader both seeks and empowers a band of brothers around him. This is how Mansfield, a quote from his book. A wise leader realizes that these people can be an early warning system that if they are allowed to speak freely, their affection and insight will make them valuable guardians of his soul. He builds a culture around himself of honesty, loving confrontation, and permission to intervene. Now that's quite a high bar, isn't it? So here's the question. How do you know if you have a band of brothers or not? Well, some of us clearly know. I don't have anything that approximates that in any way, shape, or form, right? It's pretty obvious. Okay, well then you start. But he gives a bit of a litmus test that I find that's really interesting. He said, a band of brothers is tested when one of its members pulls away from the group and isolate themselves. It's like that person is wearing a t-shirt and says, I'm pushing you away so I have room to screw up my life. And he says a true friend, a true band of brothers doesn't let that happen. And a true band of brothers is filled with courageous enough people to resist that happening. Mansfield said he's never been invited into a scenario where a leader crashed that was not preceded by a season of intentional isolation that everyone recognized later when it was too late. True friends pursue. They don't let isolation become the norm, and when they see somebody pulling back, they just don't take it sitting down. Well, again, that's a high bar, but we say we want to be followers of Christ. Aren't we setting high bars? We say, I want this in my life. So where does it start? Where do we start as a leader if we say, that is just so far from my present reality? I have been sitting here baking alone in my little kettle for far too long. Well, the best thing I know is just start by trusting one or two people. I find it interesting as I start meeting with pastors. Sometimes, the groups are pretty small. There's 2, 3, 4, 5 of us. Usually I don't go any bigger than that. And sometimes guys begin to open up safely online with somebody who's not part of their location, and they begin to share things they've never shared before. They begin to learn the language of vulnerability. They begin to push back at isolation, sometimes for the very first time in years. Here's what I'm amazed at what happens. I sometimes see in the space of only 3, 4, 5, 6 months, some of those guys are beginning to get comfortable with that vulnerability, the language of intimacy, the language of reaching out, and they begin to take steps of vulnerability and reaching out for now people in their own church or people in their own city. Some of them even say, you know what, I'm at the point, usually in concert, talking it through with their wives or other people, where I'm going to become more open and vulnerable with what I'm sure Sunday morning. Now that might take a little bit longer, but here's the point. You have to start somewhere. And I would encourage you, if you feel like you're sitting in that kettle and you don't know where to turn and the isolation is set in so deep, you just need somebody to talk to, then let me know. Talk to me. We will begin to help you with those baby steps that you can begin to take so you don't end up in that age-old story that Route 666 takes people to over and over and over again. Well, next week, we're going to kind of take the next reason he gives, which is really related to this, which is around close friendships. It really is almost a twin topic to this one. Can a pastor have really close friends? It's an important question to ask because that's going to be the next marker we look at. So till next time, God bless you. We'll see you next time. Vern out.